This is the seventh day, seventh and last day of this final hearing on this case, in this case of Michael Anthony Lichin versus the Dominican Republic. And we are here to examine what runs experts. I see Mr. Flores. I see two images. Yes, correct. Good morning, Mr. Flores. How are you? Good morning, sir. How are you? We are here very well. You know that you have been called to appear to this arbitration, in this arbitration, to answer some questions based on your reports, on your expert reports that you completed for this case, requested by respondent. First, respondent counsel will introduce you briefly, and then you will carry out your presentation. And after that, we will have some questions by the other party, potentially more questions by respondent, and finally, there may be some questions by the members of the tribunal. Do not worry. It will not be that long. So first, you must have in front of you a declaration in Spanish where you confirm to this tribunal that you will say the truth. Do you have it? Yes, I do. Would you please read it? Yes. I solemnly declare upon my honor and conscience that I shall speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that my testimony will be in accordance with my sincere belief. There is no unauthorized person present in this room with me, and I cannot communicate with anyone else during my testimony.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias.
Very well, thank you very much. Ms. Yoldi, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. Flores. Good morning, good afternoon. Do you have both reports with you, the two that you presented in this case? Yes, I have an electronic copy in front of me. Do you also have your attachments? Yes. Would you like to make a comment or introduce a change to your report? No. Thank you very much, Mr. Flores. Mr. President, I leave the witness with you, the expert with you. I imagine it is Mr. Cheskin who will be in charge of this cross-examination.
Yes, sir.
¿Debo hacer mi presentación primero?
Should I carry out my presentation first? I apologize. Mr. Cheskin will be listening to it carefully. Then may I proceed? And I understand I have up to 45 minutes. Yes, 45 minutes. Please do not speak too fast so that we can follow you properly. So this is the presentation in front of you. These are the 8 topics I will be addressing. If I have enough time, we will start with an introduction. Here you have a summary of the economic claim as presented by Claimant. I have reproduced Mr. Kasmarek's table where you see the various heads of claim. And you can also see that I have broken down the historic period with a positive one of 23 million and a negative with 28 million, about 28 million, and I will soon explain why. This is a comment I wanted to make in this, before we move on to other details. The numbers that we have received from experts from Claimant have not allowed us to reproduce their projections, their forecasts. Even the documents presented are not internally consistent. To give you an example, here you see to the left the data that we received with the first report from Mr. Kasmarek, and they were coded without any sort of formula. So we just had the written number. And as you can see, the forecast for the revenue of the Wte plant was about $72.93 million. So in this in the document production process, we requested the live model, and at the end of the day, and after several circumstances, we obtained it under confidentiality rule, and we saw some mistakes. And these are not mistakes rounding up the numbers. As you can see to the right, the Excel delta way model that we were able to see for the same year, 2019, the revenue for WTE was 73 million. That is about 10 million less. These differences were never explained, and we were unable to understand why. If the first delta way model has a figure, when you move it to Excel, you have a different number. That shouldn't happen if the models are properly built. Now we're going to see the first claim, that is the claims for damages for the historical period. Based on Mr. Kasmarek, Lajun generated positive cash flows during the period, and that was with the rates paid at that point in time. In average, the various users paid Lajun between 2013 and 2017 about $2.5 per ton. So this is for the historical period, and these are the amount we saw. And so we see, AIB is saying that Lajun should have received between 6.7 and 8.5 per ton, higher rates. And this is what leads to $23 million in damages, and also to assume that in this period, the rates had been much higher than what they see. But those rates of $6 to $8 a ton may be proper for a sanitary landfill, but during that period, Lajun was not a sanitary landfill. It was an open air landfill, and the claimant would be compensated for that during that period as if they had actually operated a landfill that was not what it was. So this is what we are saying here. And if we move on to the next one, you can see what I said before. Why is it that Mr. Kasmarek is showing negative damages? Because even if the additional revenue is estimated at 23 million, on the other hand, they say, well, we would have invested 28 million, but in the historical period, 28 million were not invested. And that is important. Why is it important to understand the breakdown? Because let us imagine that you decided that you shouldn't compensate claimant for the historical period, but you should compensate claimant for their participation in Lajun. And let's say that you accept the figures as presented by Mr. Kasmarek. So it would be a mistake to say we forgot the negative 5.15 and we are giving them 478, because the participation in Lajun would only allow for the compensation, as Kasmarek indicates, if there was first a loss of $28 million. So that's why it is important to understand the various categories or heads of damages during that period. Now, let us move on to the second part of the claim, that is the evaluation of the Irrf. Here, as an initial comment, the evaluation of the Irrf as such is based on speculation and it is not trustworthy. We are showing you here that this is an arbitration. We are economists, we are evaluators, but we are also subject to the law of arbitration. And one thing that is clear is that we cannot award damages if they are too speculative or undetermined as established under the World Bank guidelines. And the three methods used by Mr. Kasmarek to assess the IRRF are quite speculative for cash flow. That he gives a weight of 50%, as well as the other comparable data. What we need when we have the future income method is for the projections to be trustworthy, but they are not. And why? Let me show you now. Here I have a graph from our report where we show for 2020 the sources of income or revenue as forecast by Delta Way and IAV. As you can see, you see four sources. The electricity to be produced by the WTE plant, that is the highest, recycling, solar energy, and tipping fees. Let us analyze each in turn. Let's move on to the next one. Let us start with the tipping fee. The tipping fee proposed by claimants expert is not realistic. As of the date of valuation, Delta Way is suggesting $20.4 per ton as the tipping fee. That piece of information comes from data that was published by the IDB, but in the same report, we see that that average is highly biased by the high rates in Brazil. The year when there was that multi-country sampling, the currency in Brazil was highly appreciated, but then it devaluated. So when you convert it into dollars, the value is artificially high. So from the last decade, the real has depreciated more than 50%. So if we exclude the Brazilian rate, this goes much below $10. So I do not see any grounds to take that artificially inflated rate or average that is affected by currency exchange issues in other countries. What we know is that the operational cost at Duquesa per ton was about $2.48. June, prior to this arbitration, in those letters that we saw throughout the week, was requesting rates of about $6 to $8. And I think that they are too high, because when we try to reconcile the costs that we see in the financial statements of June, we do not see $8. We see a much lower rate, even though IAV in this arbitration for the historical period is not using dollar-denominated rates. So I think that this rate is unjustified and unsustainable. It is not good enough for me to say, well, in some country, in a developed country such as the US, they're paying more than $20, but this is not the US. We're analyzing a landfill in the Dominican Republic. So this analysis shows us that a reasonable rate for a sanitary landfill, which is not what June was, what Duquesa was at the time of valuation, but if it was a sanitary landfill, it would be of about $6 per ton. With that adjustment, their valuation is reduced by about $200 million. The recycling operation, this is just mere speculation. As you saw in the pie chart that I showed you, recycling represents about 21% of the revenue. But the problem is that as of the date of valuation, June was not recycling. They tested it in 2014, 2015, but they ceased doing it in 2016. Why? Because this is a global context in which the value of recycled products is reduced. That is when China issued a ban on the importation of recycled products that had a high impact on the markets worldwide. And you can see this in the various reports that we have presented. The recycling job is becoming something that is not profitable. I see it myself here in Washington, where I live. A couple of months ago, we were told that they were not going to recycle glass because the company that collected glass in my building said this is not profitable to recycle glass. This is the current situation, and this was known in 2016. On top of that, claimants assume that they would be selling in the US, but without any transportation costs between Santo Domingo and the US. And the recycled material needs to be categorized. And we're saying the cost of recycling is quite low in your model. That is to say, for categorizing recycling. But they're saying, no, that would be done by a subcontractor. Very well, then you do not need to pay your own operators, but there is a problem. There is no cost in that model to pay that subcontractor. So the recycling prices are completely inflated and speculative, given the situation at the time of valuation. My conclusion is that there wouldn't be any expectation to have a positive recycling business. Much of what I have said has been answered by Mr. Kasmarek or Delta Way. Let us now move on to the WTE plant principle. As you know, it produces power, and that power would be sold. The price of that power produced by the plant is not reasonable. First, we have two elements here, and this is my third case analyzing aspects of the power sector in the Dominican Republic. I am quite familiar with it. What I know and what everyone knows, everyone who has worked in the power sector in the Dominican Republic, is that it is a highly complicated sector and that it is not reasonable to assume that one could obtain a concession contract or a concession, a PPA, to buy electricity. Negotiations had not even started for that contract. And what I know is that there has been no company that has been able to obtain a concession contract, a PPA, and to start producing in the short period when Delta Way assumes that that is the case. They are also assuming that the power would be sold at, at a high at a price per hour that is not supported. So it's $156 per megawatt hour. And whenever the WT has been subsidized, those subsidies are below the subsidies granted to solar energy. And that clearly is stated in the 2007 regulations of the law that organized the renewable sector in the Dominican Republic. But that is the reason the cost paid for WTE has always been below the cost of solar energy. And we know that the solar PPAs in the Dominican Republic were being entered into at $100. So why would you be paying more for WTE than for solar energy? It makes no sense. A more reasonable assumption is to think of the $85 as established in the law regulation, that could certainly be lower. That change in itself also reduces the valuation by $115 million. Now, there are other changes. The assumption on the construction of the plant is not reasonable. This was explained quite well by J.S. Held. I am not going to devote more time to this, but just by taking the estimate to build the facilities that, according to J.S. Held, would be of about 285 million, that would reduce, sorry, it would be about 500 million, it would be reduced almost by half. So customer costs also assume the IRF plant that was never built, but that would be built, would continue to operate forever. As you know, this concession contract is terminated or would come to an end in 2034. So who knows how the Duquesa users would be treating the waste in 2025, 2050, or in 100 years. So by eliminating this assumption, we have a reduction of $147 million. If we apply the adjustments that I mentioned so far that I think are properly founded on the facts and the economics of the case, we get to negative cash flows. Therefore, we wouldn't even need to talk about a discount, but for this to be in the record, the discount rate proposed by IAV is unreasonably low. Here, I am showing you the three items why that is the case. The main one is the country risk premium suggested by Mr. Kaczmarek. He's saying that the country risk premium should be of about 1.5%, but he offers new supporting information, no source saying, yes, in the Dominican Republic, we need to use 1.5%. I used the average of two methods that were published. So I take the average of those two methods, that is 6.7%. But it doesn't make any sense to take a completely arbitrary number that is unsupported. And to adjust this, if this was the only change we'd introduce to the model by Mr. Kaczmarek, the valuation would be reduced by 375 million. So here I show you the summary of the adjustments that I have referred to in this presentation. These are not the only ones. These are not the only ones that I address in my report, but these are the ones that are enough to show you that if we are a little bit more realistic than Mr. Kaczmarek and the Delta Way representatives, we get to a negative model. And their model was quite speculative because we don't even know if they would have obtained a concession for selling power or if the contract with the municipalities would have been renewed, even if we had a DCF with the more reasonable assumptions. We see that the IRRF proposed makes no sense or has no value. Very briefly, as I explained, Mr. Kaczmarek also analyzes other methods that are based on the future revenue, but those two methods have the same problem or the same mistake. They are not based on the actual revenue Lejeune had in 2016, but this is just an assumption that they would be having 169 million a year, but instead of the 0.3 million that they had in 2016. So all of the mistakes that Mr. Kaczmarek has in his DCF model are automatically conveyed to the comparables model. On top of that, the alleged comparable companies analyzed by Mr. Kaczmarek are not comparable, in particular because they are companies that already have plans that they already incurred in the installation costs in the past, while Lejeune had everything ahead of them. What would you rather have? To buy a land that is totally barren or to buy a land that already has a house on top of it? The land with the house would have more value than if the house had not been built, but you cannot compare the two. To conclude, this week we heard that they tell us, how could it be? We're certain that this had to be profitable. You also saw the slides presented by Delta Way. They said, well, we would have $1 billion in the first stage and $1 billion more in the second stage with $2 billion, I'm quite sure that the investors would have invested in this highly profitable business. But first, we need to understand where the money would come from, where the $1 billion would come from. They come from the users in the greater Santo Domingo area that are paying exorbitant rates for the waste, $20 per metric ton, and also paying very high rates that no one is actually paying for renewable energy that is allegedly produced by the Wte plant. So that is all speculation. But on top of that, there was not even a guarantee that that could be the case, because let us look at what Mr. Adrian Lee Chin said in 2016 when this was already in dispute. Well, this was a TV program, and the anchor asked him, well, we have heard 30 years ago that this trash could be converted into power, but nothing has happened. Well, why? Well, but if you want us to invest in a Wte plant, we need some guarantees as to the provision of waste. And so we need for the municipalities to assure us that they are going to send us trash during 20 or 30 years. But that is not possible now, because the contracts that we have with the municipalities right now are only for 4 years rather than 20 or 30. They change every 4 years, and we have no guarantee that we will continue to have the feedstock to have this Wte plant operate. And this is what explains why the Wte plant could not be financed, and there were no other investors that were willing to do it. The Wte plant, as Mr. Adrian says, have a very high initial cost. To pay back that cost, you need to be certain that there will be a regular supply. And even though you heard that there was exclusivity for 40 years or whatever that period was, that would be up to 2034 or 2037. That is not what I understood from the economic point of view. What I understood is exactly what Mr. Adrian Lee said before this arbitration, that they do not have the commitment of the various municipalities that they would continue to give them the waste during so many years. So if they were compensated, we could assume that this was a negotiation, an attempt to force the municipalities to commit to those 20 to 30-year periods. So now we are assessing the ongoing concern, and this is what La June wanted, and this is what they have. They have an open air landfill. It is not a sanitary landfill, over 87 hectares. What would be the value of that? We move on to the next one. We have assessed that business, recognizing that it was whatever it was, an open air landfill rather than a sanitary landfill. And I assume $5 to $8 per metric ton, and that would be much higher than what has already been received in the historical period, and that the minimum improvements that Delta Way suggested would be introduced, and even if it became a sanitary landfill, at the very least, to comply with the standards, they need to have a landfill.
I performed the valuation, and the result is that there is no value. And we can see that in the next slide. You can see that the concern has rates of $5 to $8, and it would produce sufficient revenue. As you see, EBITDA would be positive. However, since the investments had not been made, the minimum necessary investments in the past, and since there was only a few years of operation left until the landfill is completely full, if in 2017 you have to do some investments that had not been done in the past, there wouldn't have been enough time to recover that investment. But that doesn't mean, in my opinion, that you have to increase the rate, because the users are not liable for this. If Mr. Lee Chin or whoever it was would have bought this business in good stead with rates between $5 and $8, that he could have continued to do this business. So let's go into the valuation of the land. Next, according to the framework agreement, the price of the lot was $2.5 million. So logically, if it started to receive more waste up to from 2707 to 2017, it should have lost value. This is a photograph of the aspect of the landfill at the time of the valuation. However, Mr. Kaczmarek says the lot would have a value of $55 million because eventually all the waste would be covered, and on top of that, there would be solar panels. That fails in any reasonableness test because we did an internet search of all the lots that are not polluted, such as the one in Duquesa, and we saw that the prices for nearby lots, which are higher than the final price normally, the offer price is much higher than the one calculated by Mr. Kaczmarek. So if you wanted to uh, place a solar plant, it would be more feasible to do it in the lot on the right than on the lot in the left. This week, they told us, well, yeah, but since the WT plant would be existing and it would be connected to the grid, that would be feasible. But they have not shown us this has been the case because we also could have a connection in the lot on the right. And let me be clear, a concession contract for the generation of WTE energy is not the same as a concession for solar energy. That would be completely separate. And there's no reason to say that having the first contract, the first concession for the WT plant would mean that there would be a concession for the second type of energy. Next. So we have shown here that there are many speculative premises regarding solar energy. The deadlines, the prices, he's assuming $134 per megawatt hour. But if you know how solar energy works around the world, you will know that prices have been going down periodically. So $134 per MWH could have been reasonable in 2007, but not 10 years later in 2017. At that time, the price attracted was $100 per MWH, not 140. And it's also assumed that it would go on perpetuity, which is not a reasonable assumption. Next, so if we go to the issue of interest, if there is compensation for the claimant in this arbitration to compensate for the time elapsed between the evaluation and the time of the award, you would have to add interest. And since the claimant is claiming in US dollars, the adequate rate would be the rate for the performance of treasury bonds in the United States. This is shown by several authors such as Fisher and Romain and Cantor. The rates proposed by Mr. Kaczmarek are not correct from an economic perspective because the claimant would be compensated for risks that would not be realistic. I will speak now about the investment that was made. I think I will have to sneeze at a certain point in time, so I just wanted to warn you. The investment of the claimant. In the second report, Mr. Kaczmarek submits a table with the alleged investment made by Mr. Lichin. I, in my second report, analyzed these tables presented by Mr. Kaczmarek with the supporting information submitted. And in the second report, I explain that the figures are not logical and they do not support an investment as alleged by Mr. Lichin. After my second report, the claimant submitted the jurisdictional reply with additional documentation. These documents were given to me by counsel, by the respondent. I review them and the figures do not agree. And so after several stages of arbitration, I still don't see that the figures and the transfers are in line with what is being alleged. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just to give you an example, August 2, they say that there was a transfer to pay Mr. Lopez. But what we see is that $400,000 were paid and $500,000 were paid to Mr. Lopez. So that is what I highlight in red in the right-hand column. And here are the details. On August 1st of 2012, Mr. Lichin sent an email saying, please pay $400,000 to Metro Country Club for the payment of our portion of the $500,000 due on Friday. That is to say, on August 3rd, as you can see here. And on August 2nd, following the orders of Mr. Lichin, AIC sends a transfer to Metro Country Club for $400,000. And on August the 3rd, according to what Mr. Lichin said in his email, Mr. Lopez receives a check for $400,000. That same day, Mr. Lopez also receives a check for $100,000. But there's no evidence that that last check for $100,000 received by Mr. Lopez on August 3rd comes from Mr. Lichin or any other business related to Mr. Lichin. It seems that it's a payment from Metro Country Club to Mr. Lichin, which is 80% of the total. And some of these companies, Mr. Asiles, for example, had a share of 80%. Next. Here we see something that I explained in my second report that didn't agree with what I was saying. The framework agreement of 2013, June 2013 was the date of that agreement. There had been already a payment of $2 million. But if I add all the transferred that the claimant says that he made before that date, I don't get that figure. I get $1.6 million. So who paid the other $400,000 that were, according to the framework agreement, had already been paid? On the other hand, they also tell us that the claimant paid about $1 million for the companies that you know about and that are mentioned here in the slide. However, the transfers of up to June 2013 do not justify that they can go to the purchase of these four companies. The transfers that they allege from AIC do not show these payments to Nahelo, Kickman, Lution, and Wilkinson. And this is detailed in the next slide. These are the payments made by AIC up to the month of July 2013, which is the date by which all shares had been bought in the four companies for an amount of about $1 million. If we compare the two tables, in the last pleading by the claimant, we see that all these amounts are amounts paid to Mr. Lopez, allegedly for the land and the shares of La Jun. So there's no place left for this alleged investment to pay the price of the four companies mentioned. Next. Also, apart from the $10 million they say they invested, the claimant alleges he invested some $4 million of his own equity for operational costs of Latun. From the economic point of view, as I explained in my report, the fact that the owners of a company provide resources to because there is a cash flow problem and you have to make payments. That's not an investment. It's simply loans that are paid and repaid as a credit line. So to understand this, they should have given us all the cash flow movements between La June and its shareholders. There must be an accounting book that shows who paid what, when, and when it was repaid. And particularly because in all the reports of Mr. Kasmarek, it is clear that many of these funds are classified as loans. The transfers are really loans. So we do not know if those loans are still outstanding or if they were repaid. So if we go to the next slide, you can see the last financial statements prepared by La June. And in the accounting statement, maybe you can't see it very well, but if we look at assets and liabilities, Lajun had a liability which were outstanding loans for several companies such as AIC Barbados. AIC Barbados had a promissory note, a long-term debt, and another that I cannot read very well, but it's Molino something. So what happened there? Was it repaid or not? We know that the date was not with Mr. Lichin, but with AIC Barbados, as the financial statements show. And in the lower right-hand side, I show you Appendix M of Mr. Kasparek, where he recognizes that some of these transfers were not destined to pay operational expenses, but they were simply loans. Next. And the last part that I wanted to recall on this, as I said in my second report, is that the price included in the framework agreement of June 2013 talks about the possibility of paying to the sellers up to $3 million for contingencies of a certain that could arise in a certain litigation. This can be seen on the screen. I haven't seen any evidence. And then after the second report, the claimants give us more evidence and they don't tell us anything about that. So I don't know what happened with that litigation. Was there any payment made for this litigation? We don't know. So based on all the evidence and all what we have received, it has not been shown what was invested and who invested what. And this is difficult to accept from an economic point of view. But if we have something that is written and notarized, what we have is the framework agreement. And there's a clause that says that there was a final price of $4.25 million. And then there's a contingency, but I haven't seen any evidence that the contingency of $3 million due to that litigation had to be paid. Well, then it shouldn't be included in an investment analysis. Also, the framework agreement says that the price of the lot was 2.5. So the total would be $6.75 million. And the investment by Mr. Lichin would be 90% of this amount. That is to say, $6.075 million. So let's conclude with a reasonableness analysis. This is what we have. The only thing I can really believe, if I am not shown the contingency of $3 million due to the litigation that it was paid, we have an initial investment of $6.1 million, which is what I showed in the previous slide. Mr. Kasmerit says that this valuation, the valuation of the concern of Lajun at the date of the valuation had increased to $538 million. That means multiplying the investment times 89, which is really illogical. How can we say that? Mr. Consmares says, well, maybe the sellers, Mr. Lopez, were completely ignorant and they had no idea that they were sitting not on top of a mountain of waste, but a mountain of gold, $500 million. And this is the only explanation Mr. Kaczmarek provides. They had no idea what they had. But let's say someone comes to me and says, I am an oil company. I want to buy the land. I have no idea how to run an oil business, but I asked a friend and I said, how much should I charge? Well, they think there's oil behind or below the land. So you get an advisor to tell you how much the land is worth, particularly if there is such a high difference. So this is completely illogical. What this means is that these 537 millions are related with what Delta Wave showed you. The $1 billion for the investors in the first stage and another $1 billion in the second phase for the same investors. So these millions of dollars, these billions of dollars come from citizens of the DR through payments of exorbitant electricity rates and exorbitant rates for the treatment of waste, the tipping of waste. So this week, we have seen several reports saying that the DR, as other countries, want to have more clean energy. I do not doubt that. That is logical. But when one invests in a regulated sector, a regulated sector with social benefits, you have to understand how that works. For example, if you, Mr. Flores says the president, you have 2 minutes. I know that you're ending your presentation, but I just wanted to warn you. If you are familiar with the electric power, renewable electricity sector, you will know that no country charges exorbitant rates for electricity. For example, in the case of Spain, the approved rates, according to the government of Spain, were intended to have a reasonable profitability for investment. One invests in the private sector and you need a reasonable profit. There has been discussions on what is a reasonable profit, but it is between 7 and 9%. If you invest in renewable energy with a lot of guarantees, the government can purchase the power, you know that you're going to obtain about 7% as a profit. How much is Mr. Kaczmarek saying that the profit would be? That's 35%. That you can see in his report. He is assuming a profitability of 35%. This is something that no investor in electric and renewable energy can get for his investment. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. You even had 1 minute left. Maybe Mr. Cheskin can begin his examination right away, or do you need time to get your questions in line? Mr. Cheskin?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask a few questions to start, and then maybe a brief break for me to maybe organize how many are left in light of the presentation, if that's all right with you.
That is all right, perfectly. So please go ahead.
Okay. Mr. Flores, you said you had your expert reports in front of you?
Yes, I didn't have a chance to print them. Perdón, voy a testificar en español, pero si no me... no tuve la oportunidad de...
I didn't have a chance to print these reports, but I have them on the screen, which is close to the other screen. You can see that screen right here.
If you could please, in your first report, page 44, and we'll put it up for you.
Gracias.
Thank you.
This section in your first report is under Roman numeral 4, land valuation, just to orient as to where we are in your report. And in paragraph 103, you conclude that the residual value of the land that Lajun is on is 0. And that is, I believe, what you said also during your presentation today, correct?
Sí, es correcto. El
Yes, that
valor
is correct.
Great.
The value of the land at the date of valuation would be 0. I don't think any investor is willing to pay anything for this.
Now, if we could please turn to page 26 of the presentation that you just provided. And in the second bullet point, I believe it states, as the waste was accumulated, the value of the land in 2017 should be less than US 2.5 million, correct?
sí,
See, and in fact, as of 2017, right, as of 2017, according to your report, the actual value is 0, correct?
sí.
Yes.
And so since September of 2017, the last 4.5 years, the government entities of Dominican Republic, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Environment, and municipalities have been running the Lahoon landfill, correct? You heard that earlier this week?
Sí, lo escuché.
Yes, I heard that.
And the landfill has continued to operate as, in your words, an unsanitary landfill, correct?
Eso no he tomado
Well,
conocimiento.
that I have no knowledge of. I don't know how it has been operated in the current world after the valuation date. I understand that some improvements have been made, but I did not analyze that in detail.
Okay, well, a hypothetical, let's say it's continuing to operate as it had in 2017, and the trash has continued to accumulate. The value of the land would be less today, 4.5 years later, than it was in September 2017 because of the additional trash on the property, correct?
Sí, correcto.
Yes,
And
that is correct.
are you aware if the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Environment, and the municipalities have paid a single nickel to Mr. Lee Chin for the use of his land and his landfill and the equipment on it? Do you know if they paid a single nickel in the last 4.5 years for using his land and property?
No lo sé.
No, I don't know.
So do you know if they've been paying rent?
¿Perdón?
Has the government, these government entities, the Dominican Republic, have they paid any rent to Mr. Lee Chin or whoever, in your opinion, owns Lahoon for the use of the land for the last 4.5 years?
No lo sé. En mi...
I do not know that. In my valuation, I stop at the valuation date in 2017. And for evaluation purposes, I don't look at what happened in the real world after that date.
Well, you've concluded, Mr. Flores, you have concluded that the value of the investment is 0. The value of the investment is 0. Well, it's 2022 today. Is it still 0?
Perdón, ahora se está refiriendo a la suma de
Are
todo.
you referring to the total of all categories or only the value of the shares? What are you referring to exactly?
Either one, doesn't matter to me.
Perdón, escuché que alguien necesita una pausa.
Sí, no, antes de contestar.
Did I
por
hear
favor.
that a pause is needed? Yes, before answering, please pause because I'm losing the first part of your answer. So please pause a bit before answering. So, Mr. Flores, once the question is asked, leave a little pause and then begin to reply, if you will.
Por favor, ¿puede repetir la última pregunta?
Could you repeat the last question then?
Sure. When you were doing your evaluation in 2017, were you evaluating Mr. Lee Chin's interest in the shares of Lahoon, or were you evaluating the project itself in the Dominican Republic? What was your evaluation of?
En mi informe, yo he presentado
In my report, I submitted two evaluations. One is the valuation at the date of 2017, the valuation date for the business proposed by the experts of the claimant. And the second is a valuation not of that proposed business, but a continuation of the existing operations with the minimum improvements required.
In both of those, you've concluded 0, correct?
efectivamente.
Yes, indeed.
And you mentioned towards the tail end of your presentation that there's no evidence. You mentioned the shareholders made loans to Lahoon, and you said there's no evidence in the record that has not been paid back. Do you recall saying words to those effect?
Yo lo que dije, o lo que
What I said, or what I meant to say, was that we do not know anything. We know very little about those loans. Some might have been paid, others not. We don't know that. We have incomplete information. I don't know if they were all paid, if none were paid, or if some of them were paid.
Okay, and these are loans to use your words, the business, right?
Sabemos que, o sea, por una parte tenemos unas
On the one
ciertas
hand, we have a series of transfers from the company, from AIC, or the AIC group to certain beneficiaries in the Dominican Republic. And in the memo, the transfer memo, it is stated that it is a loan, or some similar words are used. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have financial statements from Lajun where we show outstanding loans to AIC. We haven't been able to reconcile the amounts transferred, wire transferred internationally, and how much was received. If there were interests on these monies or not, we know very little on this.
So, Mr. Flores, you were engaged through Curtis on behalf of the Dominican Republic, correct? For purposes of why you're here today?
Correcto.
Okay.
Correct.
Now, have you asked the Dominican Republic, who has controlled the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Environment, and then there's also the municipalities, whether any of them have repaid the loans that you've been talking about since September 2017, since they're operating the land, the machinery, the equipment of Lahoon, the Dominican Republic? Have you asked anyone if those loans have been repaid?
No, no lo he preguntado porque mi interés es entender la situación.
No, I have not, because my interest is in understanding the situation of the business as of the valuation date. As I already commented, I have not studied what happened as of September 2017 to date.
Okay. And if we could go to page 20 of your presentation, we'll put it up for you. And Mr. Flores, I'm sorry at the beginning, I should have said, nice to meet you. My name is Mark Cheskin.
Un placer conocerle.
Yes.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. And in this slide, you have a quotation from Mr. Adrian Lee Chin. And I believe you said, at least words to this effect, that in order to have this waste energy plant built, you need certainty of the fuel supply. Did I get the gist of what you were saying?
Sí, efectivamente. Eso es lo que yo
Yes,
dije.
in effect, that is what I said, simply repeating the very words of Mr. Adrian Lee Chin.
Well, if you were just simply repeating, but I believe you were adopting them as your own in making your statement, correct? Because if not, I can move on. If you don't actually believe what Mr. Leachin said in this interview, then I can just rip up the page and not worry about it.
No.
And I'm not asking you to assume that everything Adrian Leachin has ever said is true. I'm just speaking about the statement that you highlighted here.
Me estoy tomando un tiempo.
I'm taking some time to answer because I'm taking a look at the transcript and I'm really trying not to interrupt the interpreters. I recommend that this slide 20 not be torn up because I believe it's true. I'm very familiar with investments of such type of investment, that is, say, investments that require a large initial investment cost. And that cost cannot be recovered in just 1 or 2 years, but rather over a period of many years. For that to be profitable, one must be certain that one is going to receive a constant cash flow that's going to enable you to recover that. So I see what Mr. Leachin said in 2016, and I agree with him. Without an assured flow of waste that would come year after year for 20 years, then one cannot build the plant because one is taking a risk that what is happening now might happen. For example, there's an article you included in the record that there are municipalities such as municipality of Santo Domingo Este who are deciding to treat their waste on their own. When you are free to do that over 3 or 4 or 5 years, then you can do that.
Right. And so then, Mr. Flores, for the feedstock to not be a constant source to Duquesne, the municipalities then would have to take their feedstock, the garbage, somewhere else, right?
Sí, efectivamente.
So, yes, indeed.
So if the contracts between the municipality and Lahoon had expired, they could just simply take their garbage somewhere else and not be dumping it on the front door of Lahoon, correct?
No, eso no funciona así.
No, it doesn't work like that. We're talking about a period, as Mr. Leachin, as Adrian Leachin says, of 20 to 30 years. Of course, one cannot improvise and from one day to the next say, well, now I'm going to dump my garbage in the Caribbean Sea. That's not so, but with sufficient lead time for planning, then one can seek alternative solutions. In particular, if the fee is going to go from $2 to $20, I might pay the $20 for 1, 2, 3, 4 years. But if I'm the mayor of Santo Domingo Este, then I would desperately begin to search for how I might be able to treat the garbage otherwise. That's not going to happen in 1 day or in 1 month, but certainly before the 20 or 30 years have gone by.
If the fees were going to go from $2 to $20, I may pay for $20 for 1, 2, 3, 4 years. And then I guess what you're saying would be reasonable then for the municipalities to look for somewhere else to dump the garbage, right?
Dependería
Yes.
de los
It
contratos que haya.
would depend on the contracts in place at that time, whether there's a commitment, but I very much doubt that anyone would make a commitment to pay $20 per ton for a 20 to 30 year period.
And so then if, say, it went from $2 to $6 for a period of a few months, would it be reasonable to assume that the municipalities would pay that while they go looking for somewhere else to dump their garbage?
Eso dependería de condiciones
That
contractuales.
would depend on contractual conditions and what is agreed upon and what is or is not possible.
Let's turn to page 24 of your presentation, please. We'll put it on the screen for you. Can we? In this chart, I believe what you're showing is, well, tell me what this chart, just briefly. I don't want to mischaracterize it. What is this chart showing specifically?
Bien, en la primera columna,
Very well. In the first column, it shows the EBITDA, which are the earnings before interest and taxes, depreciation, and amortization, a conventional measure of the profitability of a business. If one were to receive as income those tipping fees, and to clarify, I say in Spain, I say vuelco, I think others say volcado, but it's the same thing. If those are the fees, then the business would yield net annual earnings that would be positive. That's what the first column says. Nonetheless, the second column says, well, in order to continue operating the landfill, even though it's not taken to the point of being a sanitary landfill, but rather a landfill with the minimal conditions up to the end of its useful life. According to the estimates of Wte, these are investments that would necessarily have to be made. So when I add the cost of those minimal investments necessary, then the result is negative.
I appreciate the explanation, and I think I followed it. So if, assuming the improvements were made at Lahoon that Deltaway talked about, if the price for the tipping feed was $5 per ton, then it would have a negative value of 14.97 for the capital value of the business, correct? During that time period? Is that? In other words, the business would be losing money. At $5 per ton, the business is losing money if it made the improvements suggested by Deltaway, correct?
sí, lo que dice es correcto. La única
Yes, what you've said is right. The only thing I would add is that the number isn't for 100% of the business. It's rather taken as a 90% share.
Thank you for that clarification. And if Lahoon was able to receive $6 per ton on average, it would still lose money, the 90%, correct?
Sí.
$7 per
Yes.
My fault. $7 per ton, Lahoon still lose money, right?
Sí.
Yes.
$8 per ton, Lahoon would still lose money, correct? In your analysis?
Sí.
Yes.
Mr. President, I'd like to take the break now, please. I only need about 5 minutes.
Okay. You need only 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Okay.
Great.
Let's do a break for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Flores.
Thank you.
Mr. Flores, señor Flores, usted tiene, como sabe,
Mr. Flores, as you know, you need to stay where you are without making any contact with anyone. Yes, understood.
Let's turn next to R18. In the evidence, R18. I'll have to put it on the screen for you, Mr. Flores. If we look at the first page, it's a report. Could you do me a favor, Mr. Flores, and read who the report is from on the top and then what the name of the report is? You're on mute, Ms. I know it's the words of 2021 and 2022. You're on mute.
Sí. Disculpas.
Apologies. The report has the logo of the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources, and the title of the document is Policy for Integrated Municipal Solid Waste Management.
Thank you for that. And let's turn to page 31. I'm sorry. And the date of this from the first page, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, May 2017. We can make it bigger for you if you'd like. Is this a report? Well, first let's turn to page 31. And we'll make this as big as we can for you. Are you able to see the highlighted portion, Mr. Flores, on your screen?
Sí, lo veo.
Yes, I see it.
And because I believe your Spanish is better than mine, if you could do me another favor and read the first full sentence after El Estudio.
El estudio,
Yeah.
plan maestro.
The study, Master Plan for Integrated Solid Waste Management in the Community of Municipalities of Greater Santo Domingo, undertaken in 2011-2012, yielded a final disposal cost of $17.10 per ton.
Was this report provided to you for purposes of any of your analysis for your first report or your second report?
No, yo no he visto este informe.
No, I have not seen this report. I have seen mentions of it this week during this hearing, but I haven't seen it. I don't know where it is.
Now, if we, in your first report, you mentioned that Quadrant has been retained by the Dominican Republic government to assess and criticize certain things from IAV. That's correct, right? That was the scope of your engagement, was to assess and criticize? And incidentally, I'm not criticizing you for that, but.
No, pero entiendo las
No,
palabras.
but I understand the words you're saying in English, but when I say criticar here, it doesn't have the same meaning as criticized in English. I suppose you're familiar with Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant, philosopher. Yeah, that's the sense I'm using it in. In other words, in the sense of analyze, consider, take into account, not as that I criticize you because I don't like your tie. That's the difference in the meaning.
Actually, I've been sitting here thinking I like your tie. Okay. And so in the second report in English, when I would say that Quadrant has been retained by the Dominican Republic government to assess and criticize, same answer, right?
But hay que tener cuidado. Yo en inglés.
You have to be careful. In English, and I'm going to change into English, I don't use the word criticize, but rather the word critique in English, to critique.
The critique. Okay. So you were engaged by the Dominican Republic government to assess and critique, if we were to go into English.
Correcto. Así es como yo lo.
Correct. That's how I understand what I'm doing.
And then if we could go to your discussion in your first report about waste to energy, and we'll put it up for you. It's going to be on page 46, paragraph 109 of your first report. Paragraph 109. And here, you state in 2013, the possibility of installing waste energy plants, installing solar plants, and performing recycling activities was already known, and that is in 2013, correct?
Perdón, para darme contexto, ¿en qué sección estamos? ¿Este es el primer informe?
I'm sorry, to give me the context, is this what section is this? And is this the first report or the second report?
It's your first report, page 109, paragraph 109, on page 46. And if you would like, you said you have your reports with you.
Sí.
Okay.
Sí, esto está dentro del capítulo sobre...
Yes, that's in the chapter on verification of reasonableness.
Okay. And here you're saying that the three main components of damages calculated by IAV for the proposed project included the waste energy facility, the solar facility, the recycling operation, correct?
Sí,
And that
So,
all of that.
yes,
Okay. And all of those solar, waste energy, recycling were already established by 2013. So therefore, the project should have been valued. Oh, actually, I withdraw that portion of the question. Turn to page, now in your second report, page 27. Second report, page 27, paragraph 47. You have a reference in paragraph 47 to law 5707, and that's a law you referenced in your submission also, correct? I mean, I'm sorry, your presentation.
para ser más específico,
to be more specific, in that paragraph, I am referring to the regulation of law 5707, which I believe is from 2008.
Okay. And so in your presentation this morning, when you provided a dollar value, I think it was $85 per megaton for waste to energy, that was of 2008, correct?
para que quede claro, son $85.
To make it clear, it's $85 per megawatt hour, not megaton.
Thank you.
Sí, ese es el precio.
Yes, that is the price
Que está reflejado
that is reflected
el reglamento de la ley de
in the regulation
57/2007.
of law 5707.
As of 2008, correct?
Correcto.
Correct.
And the law, or regulation of law 5707 passed, you say 2008, I think it's 2007, doesn't matter. That the regulation of law 5707, you say that waste to energy was already a mature technology when the regulation was published. Is that based on your understanding of the energy as you discussed today? That's based on your expert opinion, waste to energy was already a mature technology as of 2008 when regulation of law 5707 was passed, correct?
Para ser preciso,
To be precise,
comparando
here this is comparing the level of maturity with respect to
de la tecnología
the
solar.
evolution of solar technology.
Lee los párrafos que están en esta página.
If you look at the paragraphs that are here, that is what I'm explaining.
Esos 10 años,
Well, in those 10 years,
solar avanzó muchísimo.
solar energy
La energía,
advanced a great deal. The WTE
en la curva de madurez.
was further ahead on the curve of maturity.
Thank you for the clarification. So, Mr. Flores, as of 2008, using your year, for regulation of Law 5707, waste to energy was already mature and farther along in development than solar. Correct?
Sí, eso es correcto.
Yes,
Estaba
that is correct. It
Okay.
was further ahead on the maturity curve than solar energy.
Now let's talk about solar. Let's turn to page 22 of your first report, page 22 of your first report, paragraph 43. And again in here, could you read, I don't have it highlighted, but could you please read for me the first sentence of paragraph 43?
Esto se puede ver en los precios
This can be seen in the reference prices for solar energy in the Dominican Republic.
Okay, in the next sentence, please.
En 2008, el
In
reglamento
2008, the regulation of Law 5707 indicated a reference price of $535 per megawatt hour for electricity generated by photovoltaic solar facilities.
Okay, and now everyone could read for themselves the next few sentences, but if you could please read the sentence that begins sin embargo.
Sin embargo,
Nonetheless, photovoltaic technology has been maturing and the installation costs have been declining markedly, especially the cost of solar panels with which new photovoltaic facilities are now profitable, selling their energy at much lower prices.
We could turn now to page 41, paragraph 84 of your second report. Paragraph 84, the second sentence, you state the largest solar facility in the Caribbean with a capacity of 58 megawatts was commissioned in the Dominican Republic in mid-2018. Do you know where in the Dominican Republic this project of 58 megawatts was commissioned?
no me acuerdo en este mismo
I do
momento.
not recall at this point in time. I know I saw it, but I do not recall the name of the place where it is located.
And I'm going to say if here, if the solar facility as discussed in both Delta Way and Mr. Kuzmarik's reports had been developed, constructed, it would have been less than 58 megawatts capacity, correct?
Sí, creo que estaba.
Yes, I think that it was below 58.
We can next turn to your second report, page 34, paragraph 66. In this section, you're talking about the comparables that Mr. Kuzmarik used in reaching some of his conclusions, correct? And if you want us to scroll up to put it in context, we're happy to.
Sí, correcto. Esa es la conclusión.
Yes, indeed, that is the conclusion in the paragraphs above.
Okay. And I believe here you're saying, assuming the comparable IAV are similar, the application of implicit multiples from 7.3 to 8.4, the Lahoon's real EBITDA in 2016, US 0.3 million, would result in a comparable valuation of US 2.4 to $2.9 million. Now that's what you said here, and I'd like to ask a few questions about it. That 0.3 million, that is based on your evaluation of the records made available to you about Lahoon's business? Is that where the 0.3 million came from?
Un momento que lo verifico porque aquí.
Just a second, I'm verifying the information because I see that there is a footnote 155, and that refers to the first report, my first report, paragraph 62, and I am looking at paragraph 62. Yes, this data about $0.3 million comes from the estimates presented by Mr. Kaczmarek.
Did you independently verify those estimates?
Creo que no son estimados.
I
Creo
believe
que
that they are not estimates. I think that Mr. Kaczmarek compiled actual data from Lejeune for several years, including 2016.
And with that, you state there would be a comparable valuation of US 2.4 to $2.9 million. And yet you still conclude that the valuation is zero, correct?
Correcto, porque aquí.
Correct, because it is a sensitivity to understand the problem, one of the two problems of the valuation, that is, it multiplies a multiple times a projection that comes from his projection of the discounted cash flow, but that would not be by my valuation. I have another criticism, and that is that the multiple itself, 7.3 up to 8.4, and the method are not applicable to this case. One cannot apply multiples that derive from companies that work on the treatment of urban waste, which are operating in good condition with the Duquesa land. We cannot compare that to Duquesa landfill in Lejeune. It is not that my opinion is, okay, if we use comparables method, the answer is 2.4 to $2.9 million. My opinion is that this cannot be used because there are companies that the companies are not comparable to what Lejeune was as of the date of valuation, and that is the reason why I have introduced inverted commas for comparables, because I do not think that they are comparables.
Okay. We could turn next to page 39 of your first report. Page 39, paragraph 88, and you have figure 2. And here, could you read next below, sorry, it's figure 2, below figure 2. Could you read what the title of this chart is?
Correcciones.
Corrections to the damages estimation by IAV based on the DCF method.
Okay. And number 10, daño. Could you read those two words for me, please?
Sí. Daño corregido.
Corrected damage.
And the corrected damage that you conclude in your first report dated 14th of December 2020 was a negative $118.2 million, correct?
So,
Sí, correcto.
yes, correct.
Okay. And now let's go to your second report on the 11th of August 2021. Page 45, paragraph 93. And again, we see the corrected damages of IAV, and they're now 8 months later, negative 295.5 million, correct?
Sí, correcto. Y esto
Yes,
tiene
correct. This has a very simple explanation. That is line number 6. Line number 6, that is construction cost of the IRRF, was not included in my first report. Why? Because when I prepared my first report, I was not able to establish communication, or I could not consult the first report by JS Health due to time constraints. When by the time I got to my second report, I was able to see the final report by HS Health, and that's where they present their estimate for the construction cost of the IRRF. I was not technically qualified to opine on that, and that's the reason why I did not include that sensitivity as to the cost of construction of the IRRF in my first report. What JS Health technical experts provided me with that estimate, I added it to the estimation of the cost of IAB.
And so from the 14th December 2020 to the 11th of August 2021, you believe it'd be appropriate to make changes because of updated information you had received in this 8-month period, correct?
Correcto. Creo que
Correct. I believe that in my first report, I already mentioned that there was no justification or no documentary support for the construction costs that Delta Wave was indicated and that IAB applied in their model. So I left it there, recorded for later review whenever I had more information. And once I received that information, I updated the chart.
And if you had had 4 years between your expert reports, your first report and your second report, then it also would be reasonable for you to take any other new information you had received in those 4-year period as compared to the 8-month period, correct?
no, creo que usted está confundiendo.
No, I think that you are misunderstanding this. This is just an arbitration. We're not evaluating if ideally, if we had extra weeks prior to presenting my first report, I would have been able to consult the first report by JS Health, talk to them and to receive that information. But that is not new information that did not exist. The information existed, but because of time constraints, I was unable to receive it in time to include it in my first report. It has to do with the handling of time within the arbitral proceeding.
Okay. Let's go back to slide 24 of your presentation this morning. And we established earlier that at $5 per ton or even $8 per ton, that it would be a money-losing operation for Lahoon, correct?
O sea, el negocio en sí.
The
no lo-
business itself would not be, but the fact that there were some investments that were minimal necessary investments that were behind, that is what makes it an unprofitable business.
And if those improvements were made at $2.50 a ton, it'd be even a bigger money loser, right?
A una tarifa menor.
At a lower rate, damages, rather losses would be higher.
Mr. President, if I could have another 5-minute break, please. Just a few things I want to look at. I may or may not have any other questions.
Okay, okay. So 5 minutes break, please.
¿Abro la sala, señor presidente, o permanecemos en piso?
Shall I
sí.
open the breakout rooms? Yes, please, Alonso, go ahead.
Mr. Chesky, please.
Mr. President, we have no further questions, and I thank Mr. Flores for his time this morning.
Gracias, señor Cheskin.
Thank you, Mr. Cheskin.
Ms. Scholdy, you know that if you have questions, you need time.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have no questions for Mr. Flores.
So I think my colleagues have some questions, and we could go directly to those questions. There are just few questions from the tribunal. Mr. Flores, tenemos unas pocas preguntas del tribunal, Mr. Flores.
We have a few questions, Mr. Flores. Christian Lithley, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. Flores. Good morning. I would like to go back to your presentation and the one that has the slide on the multiple of 89, that is to say, for the acquisition, and also the last valuation by IAV. I don't know if you can show it on the screen.
Gracias. Sí, gracias. Quería preguntar.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Mr. Flores, this is the investment that was to be made by Claimant, and I think between two, it was about $250 million. I apologize, but I did not understand the question. Yes, what I understand from the partial report by Claimant is that there would be an investment of $250 million. And that would be the cost for developing the site, the plant on site. And I would like to know whether this analysis includes this price. Yes, it is there because the $250 million are in the box to the right. The 537 million valuation also includes that for you to get to that valuation, you need to spend 250 million. Since that investment had not been made yet, that's the reason why I do not introduce it in the box to the left, but it is in the box to the right. In other words, if instead of that valuation, it was not necessary to spend 250 million, just $1 million to develop the plant, the valuation would be much higher in the box to the right. The box to the right shows the net value of all of the future returns minus the investment that Delta Wte and IAV say it would be necessary to make. Let me change to English. My English, I think, is better than my Spanish.
I just want to make sure we're comparing apples with apples. And that is that if you have a cost, a foreseen cost of $250 million, then the valuation that you're establishing, the initial valuation of $6 million to the ultimate valuation of IAV of 537 million, I just want to make sure we're being faithful to the right comparison. And so whilst I appreciate that the 537 million in the right-hand box incorporates the cost that would have been invested in order to obtain that value, I'm just trying to establish whether it also is something that you should have considered in the left-hand box as a cost that would have been expended by claimant.
Sí, la respuesta es que no.
The answer is no, because another way to understand this is by saying that the 537 million is the fair market value of the investment as of September 2017, based on the assumptions of the claimant's experts. That's what I wanted to say. In principle, if what Delta Wte and AIV say, if that was true, that would imply that as of the date of valuation, the business would have been sold for that amount, for 537 million, without spending any additional monies. The additional monies would have been spent afterwards by the hypothetical buyer. And that's the reason why the amount, the 250 or 537, if we take JSV figure, JSL should not be put to the right. But they shouldn't be to the left, but to the right, because these are amounts that should be invested, because these should be invested by the hypothetical buyer in the transaction of the fair market value. May I have another question?
The transcript came out in English. The translation was should not be put to the right, but to the left. I think it's the other way around, but it may be just
Yes, I see that discrepancy as well. The Spanish says no hay que ponerlos en la izquierda, sino en la derecha.
The interpreter apologizes. It's the interpreter's mistake.
I think it's just a translation issue.
So that would be at line English 076/08. But thank you for pointing that out. So with the President's indulgence, if we could go to slide 24, and I think Mr. Cheskin had taken you there only a moment ago. Again, just to better understand this, have you done a calculation, Mr. Flores? And if you have, maybe just send me to the right place in your report, or reports rather, of where would then be the break-even point in this analysis?
Sí, un momento, por favor, porque
Just a moment, please, because Mr. Kasmarek provided a number, and I reviewed that number in my second report.
sí, está en el segundo informe.
Yes, in the second report, page 47, paragraph 99. The place where there are no additional losses, Mr. Kasmarek performed the calculation, which gave $8.3 per metric ton. And I make a comment on this, saying that there are some mistakes in the calculation, which are not major, but they are detailed in footnote number 24. Sorry, in footnote 224, he corrects himself. But it's about $8. But to make this clear, let's assume that the evaluation date is not 2017, but rather 1 year before the end of the concession. And let us assume that the minimal necessary investments had not been made, not for a sanitary landfill, but for a dump with the minimum conditions, which according to Delta Way, it's about $21 million. If we did the same analysis of the break-even point, the point where there are no losses, and if there's only 1 year left in the concession, 1 year to charge fees, the same calculation by Mr. Kaczmarek would result in me having to recover $200 million to close the landfill in minimal conditions. That amount would have to have been recovered in 1 year. So even if the fee is enough to operate the business in the last year, if I also have to recover the 221 million, which should have been expended in the past, but they have not been invested in the last year of the contract, the fee that I would have to invest would be astronomical.
Break-even point, but you're not also then projecting an extension of a concession. So is that a comparable analysis? Because you're essentially taking a number, you're trying to project through what would be a break-even point for that dollar amount per ton, but in your hypothetical world, you're not then suggesting that there would be an extension in that universe.
Correcto, ese es el supuesto.
Yes, that is the assumption. But I do not agree with the calculation of Mr. Kaczmarek that says if you value the current business through the years left for the current concession, they have to pay me enough not only for the day-to-day business of collecting waste and treating waste for that to be profitable, but also to give me enough money to go into expenses that should have been made years before. I think that's the correct analysis, because once the time is compressed, the rate calculated by Mr. Kaczmarek goes up. So I think that analysis is not correct.
No other question.
Thank you, Christian. Por favor, Professor Cohen, usted creo que tiene alguna pregunta también.
Professor Cohen, I think you also have some questions. Yes, Mr. President, I have one question. Good morning, Dr. Flores. Good morning, Professor. Counsel for the claimant showed you on screen the document entitled Master Plan for the Comprehensive Management of Municipal Waste. I think that should be projected once again on the screen, if you may. And you said you did not see this document when you prepared your two reports, and that throughout the week you saw the document because it was quoted several times. From what you saw, can you make an observation on this? I would like to go to the page shown by to you by Mr. Cheskin on the evaluation or on the valuation. While you look for the page, I don't know if it was clear. This document on the screen, R18, I did see it before, including before this hearing. What I didn't see was a reference to another report that was underlined when, or highlighted when Mr. Chesking showed it to me. That's what I was saying.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor. Mark, can you tell us the page, please? Because we're looking in the transcript and we're not locating the page.
31, page 31.
Thank you.
That's off the document, not the 32 of the PDF.
Sí, no, creo que está la página en pantalla ahora.
Yes, I think the page is on screen now. I was asked to read the second paragraph, which refers to a master plan drafted in 2011, 2012. This is the report I haven't seen. That's what I was referring to. However, if you want me to make a comment on this, I don't think this is the cost for the tipping of waste. It doesn't represent a tipping fee because we have many other data on the file which provide a similar result. The only value that is higher than this is the value of $20 per ton, which I explained comes from an IDB document, which is a number that the IDB itself admits is distorted by the artificial appreciation of the Brazilian real. So this, apart from that number, which is not applicable, the rest of the figures we have seen are lower. So when I see this plan for the comprehensive management of solid waste, and I see a cost for the final disposal, I don't know what that means. I don't know if this is a luxury service where there is a sorting of glass, plastic, etc., such as what can happen in New York or another richer city that can do so. But I don't think that this is a comparable cost with the $6, $7, or $8 that we have read in other documents regarding the fee. Thank you very much, Dr. Flores. I agree that it's better to say tarifa de vuelco instead of volcado in Spanish, but that's anecdotal. Do you have more questions, Professor Cohen? No, Mr. Chairman, I don't have any more questions. I have a very short question for Mr. Flores. Today, and also in your reports, you mentioned the comparison of the land. These are photographs that appear in your reports, particularly in chapter 4 of your second report, when you talk about the valuation of the land, and you showed us a photograph of the landfill after the rain. And this is compared with a field that could be turned into a very nice golf court. I don't know if you have other criteria for that comparison or not. In your report, you show the page where an offer price was made for this lot on the right, but in the landfill, if you look at the photograph, it seems paradoxical, but there have been some improvements. There are access roads. There is electric power to the offices, etc. In other photographs, it doesn't show what improvements have to be done. So this is information that should be detailed further. So, or do you suppose this is a very top-level comparison? No, I think this is a good question. I think the appendices have that information. At the right, you see road. At the bottom right of the photograph, that is the beltway of the greater Santo Domingo. If this was throughout the field, in the field, and you had to build a road, that would be that would go against the comparison regarding the lot where the landfill is located. But there are good communication roads. This you can see in the real estate documents promoting this lot. It shows that there is an access, direct access to the road to Santo Domingo. And on the other hand, if you're talking about the best use for solar power facilities, what is at the right is equal or better than the landfill, because if you have seen solar panel installations, the only thing you have to do is to cut down the trees a bit, level the road a bit, and begin to install the panels. You don't have to build offices or management offices for the solar plants. Might not be where the panels are. They could be in the capital city. So the lot at the right in page 26, the only thing that it doesn't show is whether there were access roads for the landfill. You would have to have access roads. But if you look at the Google Maps for this zone, beside the road at the other side, there is a golf court and there's a neighborhood. So that tells me that there's electricity access. It would be easy to go to the other side of the road and reach or take power to the landfill. So I would say that the lot on the right is better for a solar facility than the landfill at Duquesa. Thank you very much. Very good answer. Okay. So you are free, quote unquote. We thank you for your cooperation with this tribunal, and we have no further question. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good rest of your Sunday. For the rest of the people in this hearing, we're about to conclude, but we need a very brief break, and the tribunal will discuss if there is any other outstanding matter, and then we will come back. So it will be a very short break so that we can conclude and we can enjoy the rest of our weekend after a very busy week. So we have a 5-minute break, and we will go to the breakout rooms and we come back in a few minutes.
Bueno, gracias por la espera.
Very well, thank you for waiting. First of all, before sharing with you what we in the tribunal were discussing, I'd like to know whether the parties have been able to be in touch and reach agreement with respect to post-hearing briefs.
Mr. Chairman, happy to jump in on that point. And myself y la doctora Frutos Peterson have connected. And I think there's consensus on a few points and a lack of consensus on a few others. Where is there consensus? And I think this will make everybody happy. We have agreed that the post-hearing brief should have a page limit. And that page limit should be no more than 80 pages. And of course, my learned colleague can confirm, but I think there is consensus on that. I'm happy to report. With respect to the dates for the subsequent filings, there is not a material, but there is a difference. La doctora Frutos Peterson is proposing that we provide our comments to the transcript by the 14th of February. And she'll again can confirm that or not, that's accurate. We are proposing that the comments to the final transcripts be provided to the tribunal on or about the 9th of March. That's assuming, Mr. Chairman, that we would get the final transcripts from the court reporters by the 7th of February. and the audio by the 7th of February. Pursuant to procedural order number 8, paragraph 42, it contemplates 30 days for the review of the transcripts, and 30 days from the 7th of February, at least according to Siri, is March 9th. With respect to the post-hearing submission, the Dominican Republic is proposing the 31st of March, and we were proposing 45 days from the 9th of March, which is the 23rd of April, which is a Saturday, as I understand it. So we were proposing the 22nd of April, which is a Friday, which would mean 44 days from the 9th of March. So that is my understanding. And then after that, there would be the submissions on costs, which I think pursuant to the procedural order is 10 days thereafter. Or I'm sorry, 3 weeks thereafter. Pursuant to procedural order 8.
Thank you, Mr. Lorenzo. Doctora Frutos, ¿usted tiene algo que
So,
comentar, agregar?
Ms. Frutos, do you have something to add, comment on, or take issue with? Thank you, President, and thank you, Richard. Yes, we were in conversations, as Richard described, and indeed our proposal, the one we put forward, well, we made it because we understood that the tribunal was interested in having shorter timeframes than were in the procedural order. And he stated the dates we proposed correctly. We proposed February 14th for the transcripts, the comments on the transcripts to the tribunal, 31 March for post-hearing briefs. And for the briefs on costs, we proposed 21 April, no more than 5 pages. Of course, we had this conversation before the issue that's now before the tribunal regarding document production. I don't know how the tribunal wishes to handle it. We are in your hands. So if in the wake of the request or requests for document production, the tribunal will have to make adaptations, then the following dates, depending on the tribunal's decision. But those were indeed the dates that we were discussing. Thank you. Thank you very much. I thank both of you. Well, the tribunal is thinking of much shorter deadlines than what you've mentioned. I'm going to mention a few things that would reduce the time frame, at least for the claimant. For example, the video, if I'm not mistaken, and I'd ask Ms. Planels to correct me if I'm wrong, the video would be available tomorrow or Tuesday at latest. That's what normally happens. But could you correct me, Marisa? Yes, Mr. President, our intent is to have the audios ready for tomorrow or Tuesday at the latest, but normally it would be tomorrow. The video might take one more day, but the audio should be available Monday, tomorrow, Monday. Thank you very much. So that may reduce the time you need to go over it. Another deadline, another matter you've raised is a maximum of 80 pages for post-hearing briefs. The tribunal had thought of a maximum of 30 pages, mindful of the documentation we have, the length of the parties' memorials, and we have no intention, particularly so as to not tire you with things you've already done, to receive repetition of things you've already written, that you've already said, and that you've written and said several times, with which what the tribunal has in mind was to send you in the week of February 7th, Monday, February 7th, that week, that we would send you some questions Now, of course, the tribunal may put more to you at some point, but this based on the discussions we've had and what the parties have presented, and these would be some questions or issues we'd like you to focus on now. Now, I state this under the control of my co-arbitrators. Maybe we could say 40 maximum instead of 30 pages. Say 40 pages. And we're thinking this because in an initial discussion, we believe that that's the most you would need to comment on our questions, mindful that there's no new document. We're not talking about new documents being added or new evidence being added and so on. Now, as Ms. Fruto said, there is this new issue that was raised and of which we're mindful. Well, the maximum time the parties would address it, and I say maximum because the response to the request for those documents is 1 week from the filing of the first memorial, and the maximum would be Friday the 4th. So if you present it beforehand, you would have it before. But Friday, 11 February would be the latest deadline. The tribunal intends to resolve this matter as soon as possible, of course, once we receive your responses on this. And it's possible that that may have some impact. We do not know. It may have some impact on the questions that we have raised. I don't know. It may. But that's a margin the tribunal would allow for a possible extension, with which we had begun to count the time for the post-hearing briefs from what you tell me, might be a bit optimistic. Monday, February 11th, you're saying, or February 14th, and you're saying the transcripts would come later. I think the claimant said something like 9 March for those. We think that's quite far off. March 9th for correction of the transcripts. Well, you have as much experience as I do. I'm thinking about what is usual, how much time it normally takes for us to get transcripts and to review transcripts of hearings. It's true, this has been 7 days. But a total of 33 hours actually of sessions, and of which is what needs to be reviewed by way of transcript. And there are 2 languages, I understand. But I don't think you need to take practically 40 days or 5 weeks for that. I think that a sort of compromise, and mindful that you'll get the audio by 7 February or something like that. And actually you'll get it 31 January, as the secretary just told us. I think we could say the end of February. I think we could begin to count thinking of that rather than March 9th. It's Monday, February 28th. If I'm mistaken on any of these dates, please correct me. But Monday, February 28th, we would already have final transcripts that would have been agreed upon by the parties. At least the parties' final opinions regarding the transcripts. And from there, starting from that date, we could calculate. Well, we had said 3 weeks, which would bring us to approximately March 20th, more or less, something like that. Yes, the 21st, Mr. President, that's the week you say? Yes, March 21st, correct. We could go a bit beyond, mindful of the claimant's position. We could say the week of March 28th for the briefs, and these are briefs that will be no longer than 40 pages, and you will be receiving the questions soon in February, so you'll have more than 45 days to reflect on and draft maximum 40 pages on those questions, and then there'll be the cost submissions. As you know, at Procedural Order 8 is a rather terse, it indicates this would be a rather terse document, so there should be no problem. So if you could send us your final briefs Monday, the 28th of March. Am I right about this date?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
Um,
Perdón un momento.
Excuse me just a second. Yes, Monday, March 28th is what I have in mind. This is much more in line with what the tribunal had thought, but I think it would also answer to everyone's expectations more or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that guidance. With respect to 40 pages as a page limit, we have no objection to that. 40 is fine, at least from the perspective of the claimant. 28 February for the comments or to the transcripts, again, we can live with that date, absolutely. And 28 March, we're fine with that as well, Mr. Chairman. So we appreciate accommodating a little more room, and that's driven because I know we have hearings in February on another matter that's going to take, obviously some time to prepare for, and it's the same team that's going to be on that hearing, which is kind of why we're building in some additional time. But I think the time that the tribunal is proposing is the time that we need to make sure that we can get the job done. So thank you for that consideration, sir.
Thank you for your understanding and your willingness to comply with those terms. Thank you very much. Doctora Frutos, para usted también.
Ms. Frutos, does that work? Does all of this work for you as well? Yes, indeed. It's very much in line with the timeframes that we had proposed to the claimant, and so it's fine for us. We take note of it. Now for costs, while I agree, Mr. President, that the costs it could be done in a very short time, I would ask you for 2 weeks, please, just because of internal organization and the fact that we have to work with the authorities and all of that entails an administrative process. Costs, I think, are 3 weeks according to the procedural order. And at that point, the tribunal will be working on the award. Perfect. I was saying no less than 2, but if you're giving us 3, yes, that doesn't pose any big problem because the idea is we would deal it at a point where we're well along in preparing the award. So it's no problem if you use all 3 of the weeks that are allowed for at paragraph 47 of Procedural Order 8. And in terms of the time, or rather the page limit, we thank you for the challenge. It is a challenge, 40 pages to focus on what we really need to focus on. We would have liked a bit more. We don't exactly know how many issues or questions you have, but we will focus on making sure we do it within 40 pages. Based on our preliminary discussions, we had thought 30. And you can rest assured, and Mr. Lorenzo as well, that if from our discussion, more issues or sub-issues come up, we'll take that into account and we'll expand on that. We're not going to artificially have you try to fit it into a short number of pages if we give you a long list of matters to address. We're not going to do that. This is based on the discussions that we've had thus far. If you really need more, you'll be able to have more if that how it turns out. We understand that summarizing isn't the greatest strength of lawyers. I'm not talking about just this case, so we are realistic in that regard. Thank you. I know that my colleague for the other party also appreciates the comment. Thank you. Anything else? I ask also my co-arbitrators and the secretary whether there are any other issues that I'm skipping over or that we need to address. Not as I see it, Mr. President.
No, for my part neither. Thank you very much. And to just thank the
Entonces,
party.
viendo que no hay más cuestiones.
Seeing as there are no other matters, nor do I have any matters to raise, Mr. President. Thank you very much, Marisa. I'd like, before bidding farewell to everyone and thanking everyone, I'd like to know whether on this point, at this point, there are any procedural issues that you wish to raise. I particularly referring to the parties. I ask, that is to say, whether the parties in general are happy with the way in which this hearing has been managed. I apologize if I seemed a bit authoritarian at times. It's simply the authority that I've taken on to not let the hearing go off course or go down paths from which it's difficult to return. So if at some point I was very harsh, I do apologize, but I would like to know whether in general you consider that your rights have been respected during this hearing. Mr. Lorenzo.
I can absolutely say affirmative, Mr. Chairman, without question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Doctora Frutos.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Ms. Frutos, thank you very much, Mr. President. The respondent feels that, yes, of course, the tribunal handled all the matters that were addressed in this hearing. We thank you. I know that there may have been moments, which I understand perfectly well, Mr. President, none of this is personal. You really need to conduct the hearing, making sure that the timeframes are respected. And so we also apologize to you if at any given point in time we are a bit insistent. It's the adrenaline and the work that one does in these hearings. But I'd like to thank each and every one of you. In addition, I'd like to thank the Secretary of the Tribunal for a great job as always, and the whole team that is behind this. Thank you very much. I congratulate the parties for the work done, which has really been very important and has helped to clarify many things for the tribunal. And I also thank you for the respect with which everyone has addressed one another. Things do come up in hearings as they do. And so I thank you. I congratulate you for your effort. I'm very grateful in particular to the Secretary of the Tribunal, who is the pillar of this tribunal, and my co-arbitrators, of course, and all of those who have participated in one way or another. I'm most grateful for the work of the interpreters, the court reporters, and Alonso, everybody who's helped us in this, which is nothing evident, it's not obvious, it's that it's going to work well, and in general, it did work well. And so with that, we conclude this hearing. It would have been better, as I see it, for us to have met in Washington, even with the snow and such. It would have been better to be there, but I think it's turned out quite well in this virtual hearing. So without more, I will bid farewell so that you can enjoy at least the rest of the day. And we'll continue to take the steps as agreed upon. And of course, everything that is said here will be put into writing, as was the case of the message we sent you this morning. so that everybody can be crystal clear on it all. Thank you once again, and we'll be in touch on this case until the final decision.
Thank you. And of course, Doctora Frutos Peterson, como siempre. Thank you very much.
And
Muchas
Ms. Frutos Peterson, as always, thanks everyone. Thank you, and so long. And thanks to the interpreters. And thank you, thank you. So long.
Muchas gracias a todos. Buenas
Muchas
tardes.
gracias.
Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes.
Saludos, señor Lorenzo.
Hasta luego, Yoli. Good job.
Gracias.
¿Nos pasas a la sala, Alonso, para nada más
Claro que sí,
despedirnos?
muchas gracias. Hasta
Gracias,
luego.
tan amable.